What a mess of components. Better start tidying up and getting all of these in an orderly fashion in the system then. I must confess I feel weird doing two GTX 1060 builds in a row, but hey, when life gives you lemons, or in this case lemony mid-range GPUs, you do what you gotta do. It still should be entertaining though, well for me that is, because literally everything about the systems is different apart from the GPUs. Going from a 7700 i7 last time to a Ryzen 2600. And speaking of that Ryzen, the cooler is pre-attached this time on top of it because I did a good job with the mounting for testing and didn't feel like changing the 2-day all thermal compound. Anyway, the cooler is in a Casa X4 that, confusingly considering the name, only has 3 heat pipes, but nevertheless it will serve very well on top of the CPU, especially since I changed the fan with a brand new AMD branded one that fits perfectly. The case that all of these will go into is an Antec 300, a case that I personally have a very soft spot for. It is one of those designs that even now 10 years after launch looks practically brand new. Installing two 120mm fans on the front, one of which is ARGB and the other has the 3-speed selector that I will set from now to low. This case really does show its age in its cable management options, or more accurately the complete lack thereof. This really isn't that much of a big deal considering that there isn't a clear side panel, and after making a huge mistake first time I ever tried to build in one of these to try to type the other cables properly, now I simply embrace the fact that it has horrible cable management. I believe it's worth it for the outside looks. Completely subjective of course, compared to the Unicorn Vomit contemporary offerings, but mostly because it keeps everything inside very well supplied with fresh air. One quirk of this case is that it is unreasonably heavy, making it very awkward to send via courier if required once I'm done mucking about with it, so this system isn't gonna travel very far I'm guessing. Fortunately, this motherboard did not come into my possession with its backplate, so I am forced to use one of those universal ones and chop it up to fit. Not really something I like doing, but considering this is a budget mid-range build, spending £11 on a new backplate is equal to almost a third of the motherboard. Plus, I have to wait 6 weeks for it to arrive from China, so the universal one will definitely do nicely. Now it's just a matter of getting everything in there, and I will take this opportunity to tell you about the rest of the bits that make up today's system. We have a brand new Samsung NVMe 256GB SSD that does 1.2GB a second writes and 2.4GB a second reads, making the system as a whole feel super snappy. 16GB of 3000 Mbps Corsair DDR4 RAM running a dual channel. I was really tempted to upgrade this to 32GB, but it doesn't really make sense in a budget conscious PC considering every single game out there does not request more than 16 gigs. The motherboard is an AB350 Pro 4 that has some nice creature comforts such as USB Type-C, plenty of expansion slots, 4 RAM slots, 2 SSD M.2 slots and a plethora of SATAs. That being said, the thing that I like most about it is the fact that it's robust enough to extract every ounce of performance from the 2600 should you wish to overclock. I was so tempted to swap the GPU on this system for a 1080 8GB as the system handily beats the i5 8400 I earmarked for that GPU, but unfortunately the vast majority of users do not fancy tinkering with their hardware to tease out every last scrap of performance on offer, and stock versus stock, the 8400 does come out ahead in a majority of gaming scenarios. By the skin of its teeth, sure, but it does get the win. Let's see, what else? The PSU is a competent 500 watt affair in the form of EVGA bronze rated unit. Not much more to say about it really, it's nice and quiet under all low conditions and I like it. Lastly, I also installed a 1TB hard drive in there for extra space. Finally, the star of the show, the GPU. Today in the form of this KFA2 1066GB. I really like the looks of this card, mostly because the cooler has some proper thought put into it. Yes, it's still an extruded aluminum affair, but it has strategic slits cut into it to allow for memory airflow. I heavily criticized the MSI Armor 1066GB for, as that one was cooking its GDDR5 memory and required modification in form of added thermal pads. Speaking of thermal pads, this one also has direct cooling to the power delivery stages, which is always nice to see, giving it a bit more confidence when playing around with the voltage placebo slider. All of this means it's a very good contender for a mid-range overclocking champ. I didn't push it too much because of timing constraints, just a delta of 100 MHz on the core and 220 Mbps on the memory. See the Horizon Zero Dawn section for details. And that's it for this build. Have a look at the photos and if inclined, let me know your thoughts. Do you think you would have done a much better job of the cabling yourself? And with that, I shall see you in the benchmarking section. And we start as it is now usual with Heaven, an older benchmark that is still relevant today as it is designed to push all GPUs to their upper utilization limit. It's like an old friend that you know exactly what the answer will be before you even ask the question. Proving yet again how consistent it is, using the same boot media and with the GPU at stock it returned 106.7 FPS on average. Compare that versus the 106.4 FPS on average from a completely different 1060 running an i7 7700 system I benchmarked last week, and it just goes to show how GPU focused it is and how much work has been put into it to use as little other resources as possible. Next up, Superposition, which is a much newer benchmark from the same people behind Heaven, and here the FPS drops considerably to 48.25 on average, but don't let that fool you, this is a synthetic benchmark and that is an extra result. Moreover, the frame times are super consistent, making the experience very fluid indeed. Rocket League at max settings stays mostly above 200 FPS, so there isn't much to tell here. If all you want to do is play Rocket League, then this is the absolute ideal system for you. Funny enough, the i7 7700 scored a bit higher here. I didn't realize Rocket League liked core frequency that much, considering that one had too fewer cores, but the frequency was bumped up to 4100 MHz compared to the Ryzen 3650. Esports I feel are the last territory where I believe a CPU overclock will still make a big difference. Fortnite, with everything set to epic, the frame rate hovered around 54 FPS. Not a bad result by any means, but I'm sure that a lot of people prefer at least 60 or whatever the refresh rate of their monitor is. And I'm pleased to say that without touching the resolution scale, going down to medium settings with epic draw distance will net you over 120 FPS. CPU is actually underutilized here, making the case for a CPU overclock yet again that might yield some more performance. Moving on from esports titles and into more GPU heavy AAA games, the first one on the list is Horizon Zero Dawn. Here we get a rather irky sounding 58 FPS in the benchmark, but don't worry, during actual gameplay I never once saw the FPS dropping below 60. I overclocked the GPU a bit and got rewarded with a 4 FPS average increase in the benchmark to 62 FPS, and that was a very mild overclock that I'm sure a lot more can be had out of this card with careful tweaking. The thing that put a smile on my face was seeing a constant over 2 GHz on the GPU core throughout the whole of the benchmark run. Stranding is a game built atop the same engine as Horizon Zero Dawn, but the developers have managed to optimize the game quite a bit more than the former. With everything maxed out, as far as it would go, there weren't any dips below 60 FPS, making it a very nice experience indeed. Until the baby that sits in a fluid-filled coffin dangling around your neck starts crying. Now, there is a seldom used phrase if I ever heard one. Days Gone is one of my favorite games of this year. I really enjoy playing it, and while the reviews were mixed, with good reason I might add, from my point of view it's a worthwhile experience, even if the story could use a bit more polish in places and the missions do become repetitive pretty fast. But from a technical perspective, with everything maxed out, we get 53 FPS on average. Not bad, but not the best in a motorcycle chase scene. Dropping to high with virtually no loss to visual fidelity means that the average climbs to 68 and we never actually see dips below 60, making it a very solid gameplay experience. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is built atop Ubisoft's old workhorse Anvil engine that is held together with duct tape and developer superglue, but it still manages to deliver some very nice visuals, albeit with the caveat that the game is famously unoptimized. Because the 1060 has 6 gigs of RAM, we can crank up the textures to high alongside all the other settings, and for our troubles we get rewarded with 47 FPS. That might not seem like a lot, but in exploration heavy games such as this, I will take nice visuals over raw FPS any day. It just makes for a better overall experience. Of course, 60 FPS is easily achievable by tinkering with the settings. Fenyx Rising, despite its looks, uses the same engine as Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I set everything on high again and we got 58 FPS on average, but unlike its stablemate, this has cartoony graphics, meaning that you can safely dial down the settings without noticing any ill effects. The art style basically masking the fact that the polygon count has gone down dramatically. And finally we come to Cyberpunk, the game everyone loves to dunk on. And I'm afraid to say it's not without good reason. All the gameplay captured here is pre-patch 1.3, so there is a very good chance that things will improve. For the time being, driving around downtown Night City creates the most demanding conditions that I know of, especially in the rain, and we average 41 FPS at medium settings at pure 1080p without any resolution scaling whatsoever. Despite its many flaws and shortcomings, I really think that this is a very good looking game, so dumbing it down with everything on low for the sake of more FPS is a bit tragic in my opinion. This ain't a competitive shooter, so you can take your time and enjoy the sights, so by turning the settings way low, I think you lose a lot of that sparkle and your experience, depending on your inclination, might suffer. And that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you in the next one.